It is now my honor to introduce the 2011 commencement speaker. Frances Tarleton Farenthold, attorney, human rights advocate, educator, and former legislator, began her fight for social justice in 1965 as a lawyer for the American Civil Liberties Union and legal aid director for Nueces County. She was elected to the Texas House of Representatives in 1968, where she was one of only 2 women in the legislature at that time. From the start of Farenthold's political career, she spoke out against lax environmental regulation in Texas, political conflict of interest, and barriers to civil society's participation in the political process. In the early 1970s, she led the charge against the Speaker of the House for corruption and questionable financial practices. In 1972, Farenthold ran for Texas governor. In the same year, she placed second in the nomination for vice president at the Democratic National Convention. She was the first woman to be nominated and voted on for that position, proving that women could be serious contenders for top positions on the Democratic ticket. In 1973, Farenthold was elected to the first chair of the National Women's Political Caucus, a multi-partisan organization dedicated to increasing women's participation in politics and achieving gender equality, which celebrates its 40th anniversary this year. From 1976 to 1980, Farenthold blazed yet another trail for women by serving as the first female president of Wells College. During her tenure, she founded the Public Leadership Education Network, a national organization focused on preparing women for leadership in the public policy arena. 30 years later, PLIN has grown to include nearly 20 member colleges and has influenced the careers of thousands of women, with a significant portion being women of color or from other historically underrepresented populations in public policy leadership. Over the past 30 years, Farenthold has continued to influence state and national politics by lobbying for progressive and humanitarian causes, including the abolition of the death penalty. She received the Lyndon Baines Johnson Lifetime Achievement Award from the Texas Democratic Party in 1998. She has also continued to play an active role in international affairs by serving as a human rights observer in Iraq, El Salvador, Honduras, South Korea, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Cuba, and the former Soviet Union. Farenthold currently lives in Houston and serves as one of the honorary directors of the Rothko Chapel.
Ms. Farenthold, the class of 2011 and the Graduate College of Social Work would like to recognize your outstanding political achievements and dedication to the advancement of social justice. To commemorate this day and your work, we have established the Frances Tarleton Farenthold Scholarship for Political Social Work in your honor. Thank you for everything you have done and continue to do. Please help me in welcoming her.
I'm delighted to be here. It takes me back to those Wells days. And I'm overwhelmed by the generosity and the kindness of the College of Social Work's Student Association. And I'm most appreciative because this has given me the opportunity to meet some of you, to renew my contacts with your splendid college, and to share with you a serious concern which affects us today and even more so in the future. I have leaned heavily on the writings of Robert Reich to explain some things that we don't get in the mainstream media, and I'm going to touch on those today. But your graduate degree from this college identifies you with human rights and marks your success in meeting a major challenge. And as I thought about it, I used to make a lot of commencement speeches, but time has elapsed, and I think this is the first one that I have addressed that I've had to be reminded that you face a tremendous burden of student debt. And we need to look at some of our processes to see why that part of our society, the help for that part of the society has been so diminished. Robert Reich skillfully presents the challenge of adjusting our economic system to our democracy. I ask you to take this challenge seriously and personally, and to join the effort to bring our economic goals in line with our political freedom, or what should be our political freedoms and values. Reich addresses the issue of the U.S. concentration of wealth by pointing out that the last time that wealth was so concentrated at the top was in 1928. 1% of the population was paid 23% of the nation's income. Does that sound familiar? The Great Depression occurred a year later. The message is clear, and so is the challenge to our society. I don't want to simplify, because there are many things that go into the plight we find ourselves in today as far as employment. There's globalization, there's automation. But the system we have today cannot sustain a middle class. And this is what I want us to focus on. We hear much about borrowing. We know about the housing problems. But some of that borrowing came about because of the disparity between productivity and wages. Wages have remained flat if people were retaining wages. And as you know, our unemployment has stayed at a staggering 9%. And we also know that borrowing, which has become an American pastime in the past couple of years, does not add to income, but brings a capacity for huge subtraction, as we see in the housing market. Our class structure is often perceived as the haves and have-not. This type of distinction is not acceptable in a democracy. And our political system needs to reflect our political principles. And concentrated economic power introduced in our political system makes a mockery what we've often claimed, which is one person, one vote. It took me years to focus on the role of taxation in shaping public policy, which is reflected in the U.S. tax code. It's a subject you really don't want to get into, but is imperative for us to understand. The tax code affects how income is distributed and is the means currently used to bring our economics in line with our politics. Our democratic commitment is also reflected in our tax code, or lack thereof. If you want a serious and unvarnished look at what we value look at the U.S. tax code. It's an exercise that clarifies the nexus of democracy, our social programs, and hefty financial commitments. From that nexus, two major economic problems have arisen, and that is what I will refer to. Little attention has been given to these, as I said earlier, in the mainstream. These two related issues are the growing disparity in wealth and income and its political consequences, and two, the relentless expansion of political power of large corporations and multinationals. Not only do we see that support in our elected officials, but we now see it in the U.S. Supreme Court. There is an increasing disparity in compensation between workers' pay and executive pay. And this is what I want you to think about, because this is the world you probably already know, but you're certainly coming into. A 2007 report by the Institute of Public Policy Studies found that the top private equity and hedge fund managers, you know, that's the new financial structure that we didn't have 15 years ago, made more in 10 minutes than the average U.S. worker earned in a year. And speaking of favored treatment of those in the top 1%, hedge fund managers' income is treated at the same low rate of 15% as capital gains and dividends are. In the past 30 years, we have seen an increased concentration of wealth and income in the top 10% of our households, and more specifically in the top 1%. In the late 70s, the richest 1% represented less than 9% of the nation's total wealth. By 2007, the top 1% took in 23.5% of income, the top 1%, and held 35% of private wealth, of the total private wealth in this country. The 1% of earners' incomes rose 281% after adjusting for inflation between 1970 and 2007. The disparity in income and wealth is greater than any industrialized nation. This is our democracy today. This disparity places the U.S. in the category with Russia and Iran. By the end of 2009, many of the rich had bounced back from the Great Recession, and the gap between them and everybody else was widening again. According to the Pew Research Foundation, since our recession began in 2007, 55% of all working adults experienced a period of unemployment or a drop in pay or was forced to work part-time. There is persistent unemployment in the 25 to 54 age group, and the unemployment of youth, especially minorities, is off the charts. Take a look at the April 29th Economist, especially on the piece on the decline of the working man. The Economist claims that one of America's biggest economic problems is work among this class. And again, out of the group of seven industrial economies, the U.S. has the lowest share of prime working males and the lowest participation or programs for training skilled workers of the industrialized countries. Poverty has worsened and is at its highest level in 15 years. As social workers, you know firsthand how poverty is an unrelenting taskmaster, focusing an individual's attention on meeting his most basic needs for survival, and diminishing to a vanishing point the possibility of participating in the life of our communities, and thereby enhancing the power of those with wealth to dominate government and public affairs. And let's finally put to rest what you hear over and over again. And it is a myth that lowering tax rates for the wealthy create jobs. Charles Blow, an op-ed writer in the Times on New York Times on April 16th, wrote, and I quote, "A look at the year-over-year change in gross domestic product and the historical top marginal tax rates show no such correlation." End of quote. The same article reported an analysis by the Economic Policy Institute that found that the average tax rate for the top 1%, dropped about 20% from 79, while the average tax rate for all Americans dropped by 8% over the same period. However, just in the period from 92 to 07, the tax rate on the top 400 households with an average of annual income of 300 millions fell by more than 1/3. The tax rate for these supermillionaires is less now than the average American. Between 92 and 07, the average household income grew by 13%, the top 1% by 123%, and the top 400 by 399%. Although, and that's the first, the concentration in 1% of our population, and what's that doing to our political system, and what needs are met by a political system that is so beholden to that top 1% and so subject to the pressures of that top 1%. And the second issue that Wright brings up that I wanted to focus on is the big corporations and the multinationals. And you hear over and over again, indeed we have the second highest tax rate for corporations in this country. Only Japan exceeds us. However, it's deceptive because in addition to this 35% tax rate, the U.S. tax code contains a bounty of subsidies, shelters, and special breaks, making American multinationals world leaders in tax avoidance strategies. And that's why I say, as dry and as dull as it may seem, we need to look at the U.S. tax code. Several weeks ago, when it was reported that GE paid no federal taxes one year, it brought a stirring of concern, but it shouldn't have been a surprise because this is frequently done. And a Government Accountability Office released in 2008 found that 55% of U.S. corporations in the 7 years studied, at least for 1 year, didn't pay any tax, any income tax. The country's economic plight has not been divinely ordained, but is the consequence of concentrated economic power controlling public policy. When the big banks were helped out, it was told to many in the Congress, and they in turn told their constituents, that mainstream would be helped too. Mainstream has not been helped. it's imperative that we become fully aware of the system that now prevails. The U.S. tax code creates massive transfers of wealth. Members of the financial system and other major corporations, and I'm sure you're tired of hearing this, exert great influence over political policy by means of their wealth and the tax code. Until we challenge the system and succeed, we will be debating and imposing on austerity measures on every level of government. I ask you, the class of 2011, to become advocates in this struggle to retain our democracy. Thank you.
Sissy, thank you so much for joining us and your very thoughtful comments, and also for your lifelong dedication of service to our community to show that there is no mountain tall enough to climb. And again, on behalf of the college and the class, I am extremely honored that we now have a scholarship named after you in the college that we will award to a recipient in next year's class. Again, thank you very much, Sissy.